First of all, welcome everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we use our web components in an enterprise setting and what we've learned so far from it, because we've been doing for quite a while. My name is Justus Romijn. I'm a front-end developer for over 15 years. So I've seen browsers come and go over the time, and frameworks as well. I also like to make some notes about jQuery. It's got a bit of a bad rap the last decade, but I'm not sure if that's completely fair. Another thing I would like to straighten up is that my last name is written a little bit different. It's Romijn with IJ instead of EY, which was in the announcement. So before this maybe goes viral and gets a lot of traction and people get my name wrong, I just want to get that fixed. So I'm working on the web components at Rabobank with a team. I'm just outlining a couple of things that we do. And I think that in the earlier presentation, we were talking about UI components. Well, to the right, you can see we've got buttons, we've got cards, headers, a day picker, of course. You've got to have your day picker there, inputs, and all that kind of stuff. So that's all part of our UI library. So currently, we've got a bit over 80 UI web components available within the Rabobank. And we are at least aware that over 120 feature teams are using our components, but there might be more that we don't know of, and I'll get back on that one as well. Our components are used not only in the browser but also in our hybrid apps. So, for example, for the consumers of the Rabobank app, the business app, the anonymous website, as well as the website when you log in. And as I think Lucien outlined, it's that Stencil.js is a very interesting choice when you are working with a design system. That's what we've got. So we're using Stencil.js. A good thing to note is that Stencil.js is like a more or less like a compiler tool. So of course, native web components roll out, and it has a very thin layer in the runtime. So you're not put burden on the client with a framework or anything. It's just basically to make your work easier to develop components in a way, like using class decorators and all that kind of stuff, just to make it a little bit easier to get going. So that's something to note. I think it's a product of Ionic. I think Ionic components are pretty well known and used for mobile mostly. So they once developed Stencil.js internally to develop their components and open sourced it. So that's where it's coming from. So we'll be taking a look at like the organizational challenges when you want to develop components. Also, we'll take a look at things that are more in technical details, like what kind of issues you can encounter when you're starting with web components, especially on this scale. So first of all, when you want to start with web components in a company, there's often like two main reasons to choose those. One is the design consistency. So when you're talking about a design system, for example, and another one, which is also pretty interesting, is development acceleration. So code reuse, basically speed up development to avoid the copy and pasting that was mentioned earlier, and having to redo things over and over again. Have plug and play. So developers can just grab from a library what they need and hook it up, and don't worry too much about the internals. Those two are often go hand in hand. So the design consistency as well as the development acceleration, but there might be times where one is not the same as the other. So sometimes you have to make decisions on what you find more important. So the developer experience versus a stricter design, for example. That's something to be aware of before you start using web components in an enterprise or in a company, because you'll have to kind of have in your head like what the main purpose is or what you find more important. So it's a kind of a trade-off. Another thing that you really want to think about early on when you start using web components is the ownership and maintenance of your library. So often you see like there's two main ways to go again. There's the community-driven approach where everybody can contribute, and there are some advantages there where you can get like a more rapid development of it, and it has organic growth and everyone jumps on board and can contribute. But there are risks, of course, in the reason that there might be less cohesion. The product might deteriorate over time as people lose interest or started on something and don't develop further or fix bugs. And then at the other side of the spectrum, you've got like dedicated teams. This is the setup that we use at the Rabobank. There's also, well, the advantage is that we feel responsible for the whole product, and we have a roadmap and a vision for it. And we can look at feature requests and decide to take them or not. But the downside of it is, of course, that you become a bit of a bottleneck, possibly. So there might be teams waiting for something, and if you don't deliver it fast enough, they'll create it themselves. So this is something to be aware of. Like also, when you want to start with this, where do you want to be? There is some middle ground here. You can also choose to have curators, for example. So you say, hey, the community can come up with ideas for components and let them do pull requests or whatever mechanism you want to use, or forking and making contributions from somewhere else, and then have a couple of people free up time to look at it and see if it's any value, if it's good, if it needs improvement. That is something you can do, but it's kind of hard to organize. Once again, it's about ownership. There might be conflicting interests. So someone from the community wants a component done soon, and the curator says, well, it needs to be more flexible or whatever. And then you get those discussions. So it's good to know then like how much ownership everyone has. At the Rabobank, we've had a program called beta components. So that's when teams could come up with their own component and would review them and help them along to make it ready to be part of the main component library. We unfortunately canceled it. It was just hard to keep people on board for a while. And sometimes the feedback wasn't processed, or they were just focusing too much on how it should how it should fit their feature and their needs and not the global use case. So but it could work, of course. It's a matter of organization. So what are a couple of ingredients to make a component library a success in your organization? One of the first things I want to mention is a consistent API. So we've got a single team working on our components, and still we make mistakes every now and then. Of course, it's hard to keep track. We've got more than 80 components, but if it's all possible, you always have to keep in mind like what you've already built, which choices did you make, and keep making the same choices. Once again, I'll grab back on jQuery. I think it was really popular because it's really easy to use, and the API just wrote itself. Like if you could chain all the methods. The options objects always seemed similar. So if you needed extra inputs or you needed to do something extra configuration, it was always pretty straightforward. So, I mean, there's something to learn from that. It's still popular to this day. And I think they've released a new version, new major version recently or last summer or something. So that says something. Like it does appeal to developers a lot if you get a consistent API. So you don't have to look it up every time. You just know how it works. Documentation is very important. You need the adaptation from developers. So if they don't know how to use your components and where to look for it, this is not going to do it. It's just too much of a hassle. So make sure you've got the documentation. I think Lucien already pointed out that some of the tools for creating web components have automated documentation generation for you. For example, Stencil has the JSON format to help with APIs, and you can just generate whole documentation websites as well. So that's it. Yeah, put a lot of effort in documentation, because otherwise it's going to be hard to sell it to the organization and make developers happy for it. Another thing is you have to think about support, because people will run into problems or can't figure out something. how are you going to handle that? So at the Rabobank, we've got a couple of things going on. We've got a community chat, a channel where where people can just reach out to everyone using our components as well as us. We've also started using, like a year ago or something, the Q&A part of Confluence, which is a bit of like a Stack Overflow kind of interface where people can ask questions and then our team tries to answer them as good as possible, and people can upvote and downvote, which we find useful because it avoids reiterating questions. Of course, if a question gets asked a lot, then it might be something which you call a smell, where maybe the API is not that straightforward, or there's something not that user-friendly about the library. But yes, often it's just some of the straightforward onboarding questions that you can solve this way and avoid spending too much time on support on that part. We also have some bug templates. So if people find an issue with it, they can easily drop in a bug report at our site, and we can start working on it really fast. You have to think about how you're going to distribute it. So at the Rabobank, we bundle our components, and it's available as a dependency, which you can download through NPM via an internal repository. But you can also opt to share it via a CDN, for example, and so everyone can use it. There's pros and cons to each of those. It's something to keep in mind, like, do you have a strategy up front? What's your ideal situation? Where are you going to? It's just good to keep this in mind. But when working with frameworks, it is often an advantage to let them have that package. And for example, the custom element schema for Angular, something like that, then it's very helpful to have a bundle that you can refer to and automatically have it detect which custom elements are there, which they should ignore. So a versioning strategy, that's a whole, I could fill hours just talking about this part. There's just a single global scope in the browser. Namespacing of web components might be a thing that's coming up, but it's just, you can have a lot of issues when you allow multiple versions to run alongside each other. I'll touch on that as well a little bit later on. And then, of course, when you're doing it on a big scale, then at some point you have to think about theming support and internationalization support, so multiple languages. And now you're going to handle that with your components. I'll also touch on those a bit later on as well. So Lucien already did a good job on talking about what kind of what the way is to interact with a web component as a developer. So you've got things that go into a web component, things like attributes, which were touched on, properties, CSS variables, and the slots as well. So it's good to have in mind, like, these are the options to get information into your component. And things that go out, it can be communicated through attributes by reflecting changes or changing the attributes from inside the component, although that's not really like something you would do normally. The properties, which are available by reference, so they're part of the DOM. So anything changed there will be changed for the outside and the inside. And the custom events. So if someone interacts with a component and it does something that you might want to share with the outer page, then custom events are the way to go. And with that in mind, there are a couple of tips that I can give you from the get-go. So one is that when possible, you favor attributes over properties. And this is because attributes, for example, when you have a reset behavior on form fields, the value attribute that originally is set, for example, by a feature team to a certain preset value is there. And even if our input field changes, so a user types something else, the attribute value is not changed. It's not reflected on the attributes directly. So if there's a reset option, then we don't have to do anything but then to ask our attribute, like, hey, what's the value that it was? So that's a great advantage. And it's just overall easier to reason about because it supports the primitive values, and it makes things just a lot more straightforward to work with that. Another thing that's very useful, and I didn't see this one come by at Lucien's presentation, but since you've got the properties to your, as part of your options that to work with, you can also allow properties to be set as functions. And I think that this is a very powerful utility to allow developers to add behavior to your components as some sort of lifecycle hooks. So I'll show an example of that as well. But you can think about validation, parsing, formatting, masking, things like that. So that's very useful to have. Another thing is that if it's possible, try to use attributes over slots. Slots are very powerful, but it's also a bit of a wild card. So you don't know what goes in there. And when we were talking about the shadow DOM and the encapsulation of it, what's in the slot is actually rendered as part of the light DOM and then placed into your web component. So whatever styling was there from the outside, it will be copied over into your component. So that's a tricky one and to be aware of. So if you have a lot of slots, then there's also a lot of options to wreck your component visually. So that's a thing to keep in mind. Yeah, naming conventions is also good to early on think about how you're going to name things. Once again, it's about the consistency, and that people can kind of out of their head can guess what kind of attributes you'll have. So for example, do you always use heading or title? Is it content or text? Or, you know, these are just some simple examples where it might be easy if you are not aware to mess it up and change the naming of things. You want to keep it consistent as well, if possible. So I've got a little video here about the important differences between attributes and properties. So as I said, like an attribute here is, for example, the flavor. So if we'll ask the attributes of this element, the flavor, it will say info. Well, that's clear, we can see it. And if we ask for the property, it will also say info, because if the attribute is set, it will be reflected to the property. So if you now change the property to warning, you can see that the component has changed its style, because that's what it uses the flavor for in this example. But the next thing we can do is, once again, ask for the attribute, but that's still info, because the attribute is referring to what's there written in the document. So that won't change with it. So that's a good thing to be aware about. And it's easy to forget about this relationship between properties and attributes and how they are different. Yeah, so it's a good thing to keep in the back of your mind when working on components. And that's why I also always say favor attributes when possible. There's also the option, if you want, for example, objects to pass in and not want to use properties, you can, of course, JSON stringify things into the attributes. It's not really recommended, but yeah, there are ways to work around that, but that's not something we usually do. But yeah, you could, for example, use a JSON string and read that and work with the object that comes out of it. That's a bit, you know, it's a bit weird to do that like that. All right, so I was earlier talking about using functions to get behavior onto your web components. And this is an example. So we've got here a regular input that can be used for a lot of different things. And for this example, we've got an IBAN input field. And on the right, you can see that there's some functionality. So A is referring to the element. That we've got some functions on that. So what it does is, if once you blur the field, it will call that format function if it's defined. And what you'll see here is that it was adding spaces every 4 characters, and it will do an uppercase. And you can see that we'll use that to format this. And what the power of this is that we've got an input field that doesn't really, the developer has the power to add functionality to it, to say, like, this is how it should format. So it can also be used as a license plate field or something else. So if you're starting out with web components and not really sure which use cases you want to support from the bat, and before you start doing very complicated things, it's a good idea to see if you can create sort of certain behavioral hooks and say like, all right, let developers do their own thing. And if they got really functional methods to add to your components, you can always think about exposing that or have that as a pre-configuration option. So interesting to keep that in mind as well. All right, and then, yeah, as I mentioned about slots, so yeah, you can see we've got some slots in this component, but with the slot comes some default styling, so it might look a bit weird. But everything in the slot, so the link in there will work, and yeah, it will. Yeah, that's useful about slots. It's a bit of a wild card. You can let other developers do in there what they want. So for cards and modals and other kind of wrapper components that are just basically a UI wrapping content, slots are very useful, of course. And yeah, about the shadow DOM. So at the right here, I've got a component that uses shadow DOM and doesn't use shadow DOM. Well, it's easy to guess which one has the shadow DOM enabled. So say you've got an H3 header in your component that you use, and it's not shadow DOM enabled, then this leaky style from the page will visually, yeah, wreck your component. It's yeah, so browser resetting and things like that is something to be aware of. And also what comes with the slotted content, it can bring styling into the component. Of course, only the slot itself. It doesn't affect anything outside of its own slot, but it's just something to know about. And although the shadow DOM is very nice, oh, first I want to show another thing. Shadow DOM also has some sort of encapsulation for JavaScript as well. And that is, for example, events are retargeted to the web component itself. So say you've got a dismiss event on a button. So there's a button in your component that you can click on. Normally, if you add to the document body, like listen for a click, it would give you that element that was clicked. But what it does, it will protect that information. It says like, that's private to your component. So we'll retarget it to the web component. And we'll say he's clicked on the IO message in this example. So yeah, event retargeting is something that comes with it as well. But there are also some downsides to Shadow DOM. One thing that we find out was that form encapsulation isn't working great at all. So normally when you have forms like the reset functionality, form data, clicking on label and matching a label with a field, and knowing like if there are more fields in a form, so it automatically goes to the next field on your mobile device once you press like next. That might not work, or that doesn't work great with Shadow DOM. A colleague of mine referred to me that this is a known problem and they're working on it, so it might improve over time. But this is why we chose the Rabobank to not enable Shadow DOM for any of our form components, which is a bit unfortunate because you have the risk of leaking styles and things like that. But yeah, the downsides are so big that we just cannot just ignore that and yeah, let forms break that way. That's not something that we want to have. And we've looked at Ionic. They got the same philosophy. So like Ionic also has the form components not written with Shadow DOM, but just regular web components. So that's tricky and good to be aware of upfront. Then versioning is a story in itself. So as the Rabobank, we had a library and was called RFS2. Well, before it was called RFS, but that's a really long time ago. There's RFS2, and yeah, we like our acronyms. But we had a big change coming up, and it was backward incompatible. So what we had to do was yeah, see how we're going to move forward. We want to make a big internal change to our components. It was actually also with changes to the compiler that we were using. And it meant that if you would use the new version, your old component wouldn't work anymore. But what we found out is that there were features that were running. They had a single piece of code that were using our components, but they were running in all the environments. So you have a single feature, for example, like a mortgage calculator or something like that. And it was running in the anonymous website as well as in the apps in all the environments. But these environments are deployed separate of each other. So it meant that the feature was either broken in one environment and working in the other. And if they would adapt to our changes, it was working in the one that would change out first, but it would be broken in the other environment. And because of all of the, these environments are quite big, so you can't just say, well, we'll have to all upgrade at the same time. So the only way to push forward for us was to actually rename our components. And that's what I was talking about, the global namespace. So you've got, even if you have a package and you bump it according to semver and create a new major version of your dependency, it's still running in the browser, and there's only, it will still, it will still see that custom element and try to make it work. But if how they are using it is working for your older version but not for your newer, or vice versa, then you got you're running into problems. So this was a big issue, and that's why we decided to do a full rename to move forward. It was a bit, it was a big decision, but it was the best way forward for us because it was such a big change that we needed to do. And for, of course, minor changes, this is less of an issue. So if it's backwards compatible and you're adding features, then it's not a problem that some environments are behind. But in this case, it was a big issue. So we had to rename our components. Lucien already touched on this, the CSS variables, which is a great interface. So if you're going to support themes, which I think everyone has to think at least about dark theme, supporting the dark mode, and things like that, you want to use CSS. So what you see here is that our notification component in this case uses some variables but has some fallbacks. But the dark theme might say, hey, the text color should be white and the border in the background should be a kind of blue. And well, the component just respects that and uses those variables from the page. So that just punches right through the shadow DOM, as explained by Lucien. So that's very useful. So when you start to think about theming from the get-go, your CSS, write it and respect CSS variables and use it. And then you've got language support, internationalization for companies that operate over the world or have customers all over the world. This is, of course, a big thing. The Rabobank was focusing a long time just on Dutch, and supporting English just kind of grew in sneakily. So what we have is, for example, when you look at our pagination component, we have some labels. So they can override the Dutch labels with an English sentence. Now, I would recommend that. It means your API gets a bit cluttered, and I'm sure there are better ways to do this. There might be a translation system already in place. Maybe you want your components to do a server call to fetch the translation for the language that you're currently in. There are ways to solve this. This is something that we are still looking at because it wasn't really a big issue so far, but it's starting to get a real annoying at this point, and we really have to solve this in a different way. But that is something, when you start with a component library, it's if you already know about this upfront, and you can take that with you in your decision on how to organize your components to respect multilingual. Some other things I would like to touch on is that for bonus points, your feature teams that are using your components probably have integration tests running with either Cypress or WebDriver, or I don't know if Protractor is still a thing, but any tooling. And they want to interact with the page and do certain user behavior and mimic certain user behavior. And if you're using Shadow DOM, it's kind of hard for them, but they probably can figure a way out. As it said, it's not completely hidden away. They can figure out how to target your elements. But once you start to refactor your web components and you start shifting things around, their tests will fail. And they'll be looking angry at you while you're saying, well, just change something internal. It should still work. For the user, it still works, but the tests don't work anymore. So it's good to have that in mind, and maybe already upfront make some sort of agreements on maybe certain attributes or certain pointers to important elements that the user will interact with. So that if you're changing your components from the inside, that if they apply those specific selectors, that the test will still succeed. So make it so that, you know, this is like an API as well. So make sure that you can refactor your own components without breaking the tests of your users. And what Lucien, excuse me, also already mentioned was the integration with other frameworks. There are sometimes tools to, for example, Stencil has tools to export wrapper components for your web components. Just because out of the box, the binding can get a bit buggy when using web components. When they use Angular binding, for example, it can have some serious problems. So it's good to have that knowledge and make sure you adapt to if one of those frameworks is used a lot in your organization, it really helps to think about this and maybe offer some help so they can really easily integrate it into their features. So I'd like to wrap it there. I could talk another half an hour about this, or hours even. We've got a lot of bumps on the ride with the component library that we have at Rabobank. But all in all, I think we get a lot of great feedback from within the organization, that they're really happy to use it and speeds up development. And from the design part as well, of course, that there's a lot of consistency all over it. So the same inputs and the same components are used on all the platforms, the websites, the apps. So that's really the power of web components, in my opinion. So that's a wrap. Thank you for your attention.
Hey, thank you. That was really intense. A lot to take in.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of hard to I don't know, to say like what should leave in and what should leave out. But
yeah, it's hard to summarize this kind of thing. It's really, thank you so much. It was really really interesting. Intense was the wrong word there. Also, I really like that some of the stuff you mentioned and went through actually kind of elaborated and clarified some of the stuff that Lucien was talking about as well. So really nice there. Yeah, we're running a little bit over time, so hopefully everyone is still with us. We have a few questions. Hopefully try not to take too much time. You ready for some questions?
Yeah, sure. And I think what I also wanted to say is that some of the tips won't per se always apply to just web components, but software development in general. But with web components, some of the shortcomings of software design that you make up front can really hurt you. So that's
for instance, the RFC that you were talking about, RFC and RFC2, that sounds like a big thing that's not specific to web components for sure.
No, definitely. But that's the thing with the global browser scope. So with frameworks, you kind of work around those problems and you just have your bundle and you don't have to care about the global namespace. But with web components, it's back to the good old days where, you had to worry about what's going on the page and how it's affecting the thing that I've built.
Yeah, that's the nice thing about scope CSS as well these days, with basically saving you from that kind of thing.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, I'm going to get into some questions. Don't want to take too much time. Not trying to rush you. Sorry. You can take a couple of seconds to breathe if you'd like.
No, that's all right. Yeah.
Okay, let's go. So talking about design systems, how well do web components integrate with, for example, Storybook or maybe Figma or other UX related tools?
Yeah, they can integrate, I guess. Currently, we don't have that integration yet, but we're really eyeing Figma. So yeah, I don't have too much to say specifically, like how it's playing along with those tools. But I know that Storybook is also something that one of the departments of our organization is really fond of to use for a lot of reasons, but mainly like having, test your feature in isolation and work with that. And it would be great if our components work in that. As far as I hear, like it does work, but yeah, you might have to take a look into it, like if it's affected by the tooling around it or not. Like I would suggest that it just works out of the box. I mean, that's what I'm kind of hoping for. I'm not really convinced that we really have to do nothing about it, because every time we have things like this, there is work to do, or you have to investigate some problems. But the idea is that it runs everywhere. So
I think the first mistake all developers, well, not even front-end developers, make is assuming that it's just going to work, right?
And I keep doing it. I'll just keep thinking, that should work.
No, even as you said, like 15 years in, it's still the same.
But those tools run in the browser, like Storybook. And,
that is true.
Yeah, and for Figma, I think that that's also the idea, is that you've got this browser environment where you have your mockups directly translated to HTML and CSS, I think. So
I think with Storybook, it's usually about the bundling, right? Because I remember trying to get some stuff to work in Storybook previously. I think it was Vue stuff. There's still some setup you need to do, and fidgeting, and
that's
okay, I'll jump to the next one. This seems like a little bit more of a criticism, but if someone from a team would want to change in one of the components, isn't it a huge bottleneck with a dedicated team? Would you advise to allow the team first to implement their own version of the change they need, or rather keep it controlled, keep it in control and let them wait?
Yes, this is exactly, I think I made that point early on in the presentation about a community model versus having dedicated teams, and we're definitely a bottleneck. However, a change, like we're also very much curating and have a vision for the components and the design department on our side. So if there's a valid use case for that change, and it might come from multiple places. And I think we've also, we're working on a platform, or there is work in a platform where you like collaborate on feature requests. So people can say, hey, this is a good idea, we also need it. And we can see, hey, this is actually something that's probably is required, and we can check with design, like, hey, what do you think? And they say, well, this is a great idea. Yeah, then we'll work on it and release it. But the other side of the spectrum is, of course, all right, is sometimes a bottleneck, but leaving it open for, like, if a lot of those efforts get in there, and even if people are working, like they have their own idea of adding a feature to one of our components, it's really annoying to let them down if we don't think it's good enough, or they might not aware that we have certain rules about how we do things. So if you want to really support the integrity of your products, it is quite a risk. But I'm sure that it could work, and it also kind of leans on what the average level is like for developers, and how they can work on things like components, and if they have the right mindset, and you've got a couple of curators. I think that normally should work. So it's definitely an option if you're afraid of having a bottleneck. For us currently, we've had some time where we really were a bottleneck for a couple of teams, and they were really waiting for us to release a certain feature. But that time is behind us now. We've got a lot of components, so there's often like a temporary workaround they can work with until we've added a feature that they were waiting for. So it's not really an issue for us, at least.
Yeah, I would usually say at the start of a project, it's usually the biggest bottleneck. Once you've actually become established, it's a lot easier.
Yeah.
Okay. One more about basically like user accessibility. So some companies use frameworks which work nicely for hybrid development. So like web and native, for instance, React Native. How would you like go about something like that with web components, or would you just avoid that?
I'm not sure if there are tools that gonna transpile your web components to native content. I don't think so. That's where tools like React Native step in and shine. So we currently have a hybrid app where we're just using, of course, the browser, like the web view. And for accessibility, that actually works really nice as well with Shadow DOM. So as long as you yeah, keep thinking about accessibility when building a component. So for example, I showed a notification that was dismissible. So the dismiss icon was just a button. So it means you could tap to it and press space or enter and it will dismiss the button. Like those are the basics that apply to your regular HTML as well. And you don't have to jump through hoops and screen readers and voiceover and things like that. It will still respect it if it's part of your web component or not. But yeah, translating that to actual native code or Swift or whatever. Yeah, I don't have any experience with that. I'm not sure if there's tooling, so I probably wouldn't recommend trying that with web components. If you got native apps, then yeah, that's,
there's always a use case, right? I mean, you wouldn't really pick something. Well, in my opinion, I wouldn't pick up web components because I don't have the experience with it anyway. But I think that's something that you really have to sit down with your team and architect, right? You'll figure out right before you actually start the project. So
yeah,
makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, there's still a few questions. How do web components handle accessibility? Is there anything to take into consideration? Now, I know you kind of answered this a little bit with tabbing on the button icon.
Yeah.
But...
Yeah, so we definitely had some bumps on the road here with accessibility, but that's not really because of the technique, but more or less like we wanted to do too much for the user. So sometimes we would already say like if there was, say, an area label or whatever missing, and then we would construct it based on slots that were filled and grab the content. But that's all like you know, that was kind of a mistake, and then you're stuck with it. And as I said, like versioning, so deprecating something is an awful process, and yeah, that's because of the global namespace and all of that. So, but in general, if you keep accessibility in mind, just your semantic markup, use a button when it's a button, use a link when it's a link, you know, use form fields where possible, or if you have proxy, like if you've got proxies for your form fields because you wanted to make it a certain design, then you know, use the area instructions on it, and yeah, it will figure it out just fine, because those tools work with like the fully rendered DOM, and they just go through the shadow DOM as well. That's not a problem. So that's definitely something you shouldn't worry about too much.
Okay, thank you. Last one, which I agree with, kind of web, I say kind of because it's a lot to take in. I still need to do my own research, but web components sound great. Do you have any can't speak English now. Do you have any advice for convincing the business to start using web components?
Yeah, so I think Lucien already gave a couple of good points as to why they're good. It's web standard, so frameworks come and go, but you know, as long as you're using tools that are close to the browser, you know, you've got a bit more guarantee it will last longer. So that's always a good way to convince you know, people from business, saying like you have to do less migrations or things like that, which they often find frightening. So it's good to mention that. Yeah, code reuse, you can really accelerate teams all over the board. You don't have a buy-in on a framework anymore because, you know, there's still some work involved, but you know, there's a way to support everyone. So and I think that server-side rendering of web components is also on the way, and I think it's already possible. It's just not that mainstream, I think. But yeah, so there's a lot of reasons that make it interesting. Of course, there are downsides, as I said, like the name spacing. There are certain things that just don't work that great. You've still got the risk of CSS bleeding. So yeah, of course, there are downsides to it. But if you look at the long run and the possibilities it has, yeah, web components are, especially on a larger scale, can really speed up your development, and yeah, also as a side effect, create a nice generic look and feel.